Eager.
All right. I think we can get started. So if everyone who joins can mute yourself unless you want to speak, and then we can leave the questions to the end. You can also type in the question in the chat box. So at the end, either Karen or I can go through those questions. Other than that, Karen, do you want to introduce the speaker today?
Great. Yes,
Thank you.
thank you, Song. I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. David Hammond. Dave is a professor and university research chair in the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo. His research portfolio spans many areas, from his studies on vaping policies and e-cigarette use to his work in cigarette and tobacco control policies, food and nutrition policies, and cannabis use policies. Simply put, Dave is among the most accomplished public health scientists in Canada and, in fact, in the world. He is routinely named to the Reuters lists of the world's most influential scientific minds for being among the most highly cited researchers globally. He has served as an advisor to the World Health Organization and as a consultant on public health regulations for more than a dozen countries across the globe. So we are really quite fortunate to have Dave share some of his work with us today. So thank you, Dave, for being here, and please take it away.
Thanks, Karen. That's a very generous introduction. And I'll just start by saying that I've visited Roswell Park several times, and I've been working with Andy and Rich and Mache and Mike Cummings for many years. So it's been a wonderful collaboration, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today. So I've been asked to talk a bit about youth vaping, and I'm going to talk about nicotine, and I'm going to talk about cannabis. Before I do, I don't have any industry commercial conflicts to declare. I do provide paid expert witness testimony in cases. This is typically when companies challenge public health laws, and that includes in tobacco, vaping, and cannabis. And I testify on behalf of governments and public health authorities. Okay. So as soon as I figure out how to advance my slides reliably. So look, I'm sure most or all of you are very familiar with this. I find this always a very challenging topic to present on because it is so, it's divided the public health and tobacco control community. And just as one small example, I received a lovely Christmas message from the president of the American Vaping Association calling me a killer. Not the first time it's happened, and it's happened since, but this is such a charged area, and my job is to try and be as faithful as I can to our work and our evidence, and I'll try and let you know when I have a personal opinion as opposed to my reading of the evidence. And here's why it's so divisive and difficult. Half the community is shouting that e-cigarettes can help people to quit smoking. The other half is shouting that e-cigarettes can promote uptake of youth. And of course, why it's such a difficult argument is because there's evidence that both of these are true. And our inability to grasp what feel like mutually exclusive truths but are not is really fueling the debate. And from my perspective, the question from public health and harm reduction is how can we maximize the first and minimize the second? And that's a little bit of a different question to saying, well, is there greater epidemiological and public health benefit from one of these two? The bottom line is if we can maximize the first and minimize the second. So I'll just say straight off the bat, I'm not going to be talking a lot about adults and vaping. I'm happy to answer questions on that. But I just so you're aware, the evidence clearly suggests that e-cigarettes can be an effective form of NRT, and it's really about getting people to use it for the purpose of quitting smoking rather than other purposes. And so I'm going to focus on the second point here, but I'll try and come back to the first a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to show you some findings that I've presented before. These come from what we call our ITC youth vaping surveys. By the way, I think someone may need to mute themselves. I'm getting a bit of feedback. We've published on this a lot, and so I'm not going to give you lots of background, but just so you know, the repeat cross-sectional surveys, 16 to 19-year-olds, that's the age where we see the biggest increases in both vaping and smoking. And we do them in different countries, same methods in different countries with very different regulatory approaches, Canada, US, and England. And I'm happy to give you more background about those, but you'll probably know that England is a little bit less restrictive than Canada and the US, where it's a bit more liberal, but Canada went from not allowing any nicotine-containing cigarettes before 2018 to having opening our market very much like the US, and now we're going back and restricting it much more so than the US. So Canada's an interesting sort of off on off type of design. And in terms of sample sizes, I'll be showing you data from about 65,000 youth across the countries and years. So let's get that out of the way. One of the big questions is how is the prevalence of vaping changing in these countries, and are they changing at similar rates? And I'm showing you a graph that you'll get used to me showing the US data in a blue line, England in a green line, Canada in a red, and again, this is all 16 to 19-year-olds. So here's our estimates since 2017. And you can see the increases in past 30-day, past month vaping. Canada took a little while to catch up, and then we pretty much exactly caught up to the US. You can see it's being consistently lower in England. And most people are quite interested in trying to understand what's happened in the last year. So we had 2 surveys. We had one in Feb 2020, one in August 2020. And you can see that up till February 2020, and by the way, most of our surveys were completed before sort of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders came into place. Sort of a bit of a leveling off, but still sort of increases in the 3 countries. And then you can see the notable declines over the first 6 months of 2020. Now, a lot of people use past 30 days. Here's another measure, which is a bit more frequent or intensive, vaping 20 or more days per month, and you can see that it follows the same trends. But what you see is even more distance between the trend in England, the green line, and the US and Canada. And that's what we found repeatedly, which is it's not just that more kids are vaping in North America, they're actually vaping more frequently. But just like past 30 days, you can see that there's been a notable decline in both past 30 day and also, as I'm showing you here, 20 or more days a month in 2020. And that is obviously good news for those that are concerned about this. Let me just pause here because a lot of you or some of you might be sort of aware of other estimates from the US monitoring the future, the National Youth Tobacco Survey, and of course PATH, which Andy and others helped lead. And I show this partly so you can interpret our estimates, but also so you can see how the different surveys map onto each other. They have different point estimates. So some are higher, some are lower, but you can see the trends are very similar. And what you see is the 2020 data from Monitoring the Future didn't show the same level of decline as did the NYTS data in 2020. Interestingly, our estimates up until Feb 2020 look a lot like MTF. And then between February and August last year, they look a lot like the decline in NYTS. So I suspect that NYTS and MTF are probably just picking up slightly different periods of sort of the COVID pandemic effect, but overall very consistent with our own estimates. What's happened with smoking? Well, the disclaimer here is that we actually weight our data using NYTS, using the National Monitoring Survey in Canada. So the smoking trends that you're seeing here are actually those of the monitoring surveys. We don't have a bigger survey in England to weight our past data prevalence to. So you see that smoking is both higher in England in our survey, and you see this interesting spike around February 2020. We're not the only survey to indicate that. Some of you will know the smoking toolkit survey that Robert West and Jamie Brown lead. They also found something similar, but good news is it's come sort of back down to trend in August 2020. Okay, we can look further than just like the overall prevalence of vaping or smoking. And one of the trends we've seen over the course of our 5 survey waves is that the proportion of vapors, so I'm showing you data from past 30-day vapors, they are more likely to report feeling addicted. And this is true of different indicators of addiction, whether it's perceived addiction or smoking urges. And what these bars show you is of past 30-day vapors, the red portion of the bar is those that say they feel very addicted to vaping. The amber part is those that say a little addicted to vaping. And you can see that that's increased over time. And it's actually stayed fairly stable in 2020. So although we've shed some numbers in terms of the profile of vapors, it looks very similar to before. And this is what the data looks like in the different countries. So I just showed you what is essentially the blue line, those that say they're a little or very addicted. You can see that, again, Canada lagged and then we caught up. And you can see that England has actually made up some ground in 2020, and that's something that we'll be looking at. Up to then, we saw past 30-day younger vapors in England were a little less likely to report feeling addicted. And that's true across a number of different indicators, as I've shown you. So kind of the overall pattern that we've seen, as I've said, is higher frequency of vaping in England and Canada and the US than England. And vapors in Canada and the US are reporting more intensive use, higher indications of dependence. And the question is, why is that? Now, I'm not going to pretend that I have a definitive answer for you, but I'll start off by saying that what we're picking up among the youth is reflective of very different markets. And I'm going to give you some data on products and things that people use in a minute. But here's actually data from the national surveys, which includes adults. And I'm just showing you data from Canada on the left and the UK on the right. And it just visually depicts what are very different markets. So you can see that it's the proportion of vapors that are never smokers, those that there's really no harm reduction benefit. You can see how different that is between Canada and the UK. In Canada, it's 38% of all our vapors in Canada. In the UK, it's 4%. And you can see the age difference as well, which is the bottom two charts, which is in Canada, half of our vapors are 24 years of age or younger. Most of those are actually never smokers. And you can see that compares to 8% in the UK. So very different patterns in different markets, and reflects what we're seeing among young people. So why is that? Well, as most of you probably know, they have a different class of products. England is still subject to the European Union Tobacco Products Directive, which sets a limit of 2% nicotine concentration. So that's 20 milligrams per mil. So the jewels that they sell in England have about a third of the nicotine concentration of the jewels that are sold, the most popular ones in the US and Canada. So a third of the nicotine. And we see this reflected in our own data. So we actually ask people to self-report their nicotine concentration. Not everybody knows. But among past 30-day vapors, this is what you see. Much higher levels of youth vapors in Canada and the US reporting that they use a concentration at least or above 2% nicotine. And you can see that's much lower. And that's been consistently that way over the last couple of years. We also ask about salt. So some of you will know that when you get about 2% or above, they typically use a different sort of base or formulation, which are it's a salt-based formulation. So it's another way of asking about this class of products, and you see that similar differences. Fewer people are aware of this, but similar differences. And interestingly, when we compare our youth data with a corresponding set of surveys that adults answer, you can see that these products appear to be more prevalent among youth. So youth are actually more prevalent to be using the type of Juul product that is very high nicotine concentration. And one of the things we've been looking at, as many others have too, is does it matter what type of product you use? Our data suggests that it seems to. So past 30-day vapors that tell us that they're using a product that has higher nicotine concentration are much more likely to tell us that they feel little or very addicted. So that's the bar on the far right. I'm showing you those that say they don't know, or it's no nicotine compared to less than 2% versus higher than 2%. So you see sort of a gradient there. You also see this in sort of more behavioral indicators. So this is vaping more than 20 times per day. So that would be very high among youth vapors, just like most youth smokers don't smoke 20 cigarettes a day. But you can see how much it increases among those who tell us that they're using higher nicotine concentration products. And this is true sort of across the different indicators that we have. Now, most people, and I've been doing it, equate higher nicotine salt-based products with Juul. That Juul absolutely innovated this. They broke the ground. But one of the themes from our data is that, as I'll show you in a minute, that the Juul type of product, the e-liquid solution, has now, pervades a wide range of brands. So it's no longer unique to Juul. And in fact, when we look at something that urges to vape, and this is also true of the other measures I've shown you, it's non-Juul high nicotine salt-based brands that we see the vapors are reporting the greatest indicators of dependence. And there's probably some interesting reasons for that, but it's not specific to the brand. It is more the product that matters in that nicotine profile. So there are also differences in not just products, but in marketing. And one of the things that we do is we measure where our respondents see marketing. We ask it for, I think, 12 or 15 different settings. So that would be things like on TV or in stores or magazines. And we have different measures of this. And what I'm showing you here is just from the first 3 years of our data. Again, England in green, US in blue, and Canada in red. And you can see that England started higher. The US goes up quite a bit. Canada goes up and sort of lands right where England is. Now, why would I be saying that marketing might be associated with greater frequency and intensity of vaping in Canada compared to England if the marketing is the same? Well, Canada is an interesting jurisdiction, and we have federal regulations, but we have, just like you do in the US, our provinces have very different rules. I should take that back. I mean, you don't have the same variation in state level marketing regulations, but in Canada, we have some that have greater restrictions on marketing than England, and we have some that have lower restrictions on marketing in England. And if you pull these apart, what you see is that the strength of restriction or regulation is very strongly associated with how much is actually reaching youth, how much they tell us that they see. And this is very specific, so that if one province bans it at the point of sale, you see lower levels of exposure in the point of sale in that province compared to others. So it's specific to the channel or the type of marketing. And this is just sort of, I'm now showing you trends over those 3 years across specific provinces, our 5 biggest provinces. And what this tells you is that those in red that had the strongest restrictions on vaping, advertising, and marketing, it basically didn't change. The ones in green that had the least restrictive environments, you can see it's in those provinces that vaping marketing was reaching kids. And so there's a lot of literature on what's the effect of seeing ads. There's a lot less on what's the effect of restricting those. But we have a very good natural experiment in Canada which suggests that restrictions are effective. Now, of course, one of the questions is okay, but don't we want to let adult smokers know about these products in case they're to use them to quit and help them to quit? What's interesting is that I've been showing you the data on youth. This is from our adult surveys that Jeff Fong and Andy and Richard Machi and many others are involved in. And over the same period where I've been showing you increases in the US and Canada, we found very few changes over time among adults. So the overall noticing e-cigarette marketing was flat across 2016 and 2018. Actually went down among adults in the England surveys, and it was very much flat in the US and Canada. And in fact, one of the things we've done in a recent report that I think is coming out this week or last week is to directly compare. And this is showing you some of the different marketing channels. And what you find is that youth are far more likely to recall seeing marketing and advertising, to being exposed to it, than are adults. Now, bear in mind that these are all either former or current adult smokers. So these are the groups that you would hope would be reached by some of the marketing. And most of the youth are, of course, non-smoking, non-vaping. So we've got it backwards here. In fact, we have another graph where we look at never smokers among youth compared to adults, and it's the same thing. So we are reaching the groups that we hope to protect, and we're probably not reaching the groups that for whom there might be benefit. So what about flavor restrictions? This is obviously, there's a number of states that are implementing flavor restrictions. You will also know that there was a federal ban on subcategories of products that came in January, February 2020. So what this said is that you can only have tobacco and menthol for pod or cartridge-based products. So that would apply to Juul. Other products like fruit-flavored products would be prohibited, but only in pod or cartridge-based products. So we measure among past-day vapors which flavors they're using, and this is our data across the 5 waves. Now, this is a busy graph, but let's have a look at it. The top line is fruit. So that has always been the most popular flavor among younger vapors. Then you have menthol or mint in green. Then you have candy in pink. tobacco in brown, and then a mix of tobacco menthol in the dark green at the bottom. So that ban came in somewhere January, February of 2020. And if you look at this right away, you go, like this is everybody in. It wasn't banned in all products, but you don't see much of a decrease. And in fact, if we line that up with the same data that we collect in other countries, you can see that I've indicated in the US that red bar is the one in which the federal flavor ban on pods and cartridges came in. Quite simply, there's no indication. I'm showing you the proportion of vapors that used a fruit flavored e-cigarette. There's no indication that it decreased, either within the US over time or compared to Canada or England in terms of the trends in those countries. What it probably did is change the type of products that youth are using. So this is a big graph that looks at the 5 most popular brands as of August 2020. This is in the US only again, and that yellow line is Juul, and you can see its rise. Our survey, it's not quite as high as a few others, but it's almost half. And then you can see that actually the market share of Juul did fall in 2020. There's other brands involved, but you can see that green one. What's the green one? It's Puff Bar. So Puff Bar is a disposable product that has e-liquid profile very similar to Juul. And you can see that it went from 0. We did not have 1 out of over 4,000 respondents in August 2019 tell us they use Puff Bar. And in our data, at least, it became the most popular brand among past 30-day vapors by August 2020. Again, Puff Bar is a disposable product, so in theory, it was not subject to the flavor restrictions. And do we see a similar rise in Puff Bar in Canada and England? We don't. There was a few people. For better, for worse, most things in the US spill across our border. It feels like there's a few Canadian vapors in red there that said they use Puff Bar, but you can see this was a US phenomenon. I'm just going to show you the side of interest. This is Juul. So that blue line, that's the one I just showed you in yellow a couple slides back. But interestingly, you see a similar trajectory for Juul in Canada and England, but not quite as dramatic. So Juul did not come onto the Canadian market legally until September 2018. It didn't come out in the England market until June 2018 as well. So you can see that Juul is popular, but it never quite reached the same heights. And remember, the Juul in England is the one that has about 1/3 of the nicotine concentration. But in all 3 countries, it certainly plateaued and decreased a bit in 2020. So that's the brand. I mentioned to you that Puff Bar was disposable. Well, let's look at that. Let's look at the type of device that people, past 30-day vapors, are using. And this is the US, and you can see the blue line is the rise of cartridge pods. That essentially traces the rise of Juul in this population. You can see, though, that it dipped in 2020. You can see that refillable tanks, which is the product that most people associate with vape shops and things, it's been declining for some time. And you can see that disposables were ticking along at about 13-14% until they rose to almost 40% of the market by August 2020. That is the Puff Bar brand. And it's not just Puff Bar. There was an overall increase in disposable products, those that were not covered by the flavor ban. And again, if you look at other countries like Canada, you see a similar trends over time with the rise of cartridges, the decline of tanks, except for that pattern continued into 2020. And we saw a bit of an uptick in terms of disposable, but nothing like was seen in the US. So this was, again, a US phenomenon. And in England, the story is actually quite different and quite interesting. There, refillable tanks remain the dominant product, including among young people. That's very different than North America. You can see cartridge pod-based. They haven't quite cracked the 1/3 of users. In fact, they dipped a little bit. And you can see disposables have sort of been hovering along the bottom. But youth vapors, and it's also true of adult vapors in England, are much more likely to use refillable tanks, box mods, whatever you want to call them. And that's quite a difference from North America. All right, I'm going to switch to talking about cannabis in just a second. But first, I have trouble getting through any presentation about youth without being asked about well, is there gateway effect towards vaping towards smoking, or is it displacement of vaping away from smoking? So I'll tell you what my opinion is, and we can talk about it later if you want. And of course, this is one of those thorny issues in vaping where it seems like people are shouting the opposite answers at each other. Folks that perceive a gateway effect point to the very strong association at the individual level. Kids who vape are more likely to subsequently start smoking. On the other hand, you have people that perceive displacement, and what they say is, well, wait a minute, but the overall prevalence of smoking has been going down at the same time when the prevalence of vaping has been increasing. They are both correct. I'll say one thing about the displacement and sort of prevalence piece. And this is sort of what folks, they look at when they're seeing displacement. They go, look, vaping, the blue line's gone up. These are, I'm using NYTS vaping because it's over a longer period, whereas MTF smoking is over a longer period as well. You go, look, they're crossing lines. Isn't that a suggestion that increased in vaping means that it's helping to reduce smoking? And they say, look, we've been setting new record lows in smoking. The point that I make is that actually we've been setting new record lows in smoking for, I think in the US, it's something like 20 out of the past 21 years or 21 out of the last 22 years. Smoking among youth has been going down in North America for more than 2 decades. And over the past few years, some years it's been going down at a quicker rate, some years at a slower rate, but it's a different perspective. We should be setting new record lows in youth smoking because that's been the norm for the past 20 years. And it does give a little bit of context. Oh, I think someone might need to mute their microphone. And this is true in Canada and other countries as well, where we've got long sort of the secular trend. And so people try and model, well, is it a little quicker or is it a little slower? Most of those modelings are heavily dependent on their assumption. So if you predict that smoking would have plateaued over the last few years, you're going to suggest that vaping is helping to decrease smoking. If you predict that it would continue along the same line, you're probably going to predict not much of an effect. My own opinion here is that I don't see a market effect of vaping on prevalence of smoking either way. Both of those things are plausible. I think for the most part, we've seen smoking declining at historical rates. And so I need to be convinced that it's either going down more quickly or more slowly, and I don't see compelling evidence for that either way. But of course, most people would say that vaping among youth is important in its own right. So where does this leave us? Well, the reduction in vaping has really brought us back to 2018 levels during the 2020 pandemic. That's certainly good news. 2020 levels were reasonably high. So I think we'll see where things go in the next couple of years, but it's nice to see it declining. I think the flavor restrictions, the federal restrictions, have had limited, if any, impact on the use of flavored e-cigarettes among youth. Putting those restrictions on one subcategory of products, doesn't appear to have been effective. Of course, there are much more comprehensive flavor bans in certain U.S. states and other countries, and I suspect that it might be a different case. And as I said earlier, we talk a lot about Juul for good reason, but we've seen a market-wide shift to the type of e-liquid nicotine profile in Juul products. I think when we looked at it, 14 of the top 15 brands popular among youth in the 3 countries all offered versions of high nicotine salt-based products. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is probably, people have different positions on this. So look, in terms of what it's doing to youth smoking and is it associated with the rise in frequent vaping and not just being an experimental vapor, I think it is, and I think we can conclude that now. So from an initiation standpoint among kids, that's probably bad news. Well, it might be good news if you're trying to find a product that will effectively compete with combusted smoked cigarettes among current smokers. And so it's very interesting, and you'll be aware that there's probably a half dozen or more papers in the last even 4 or 5 months that suggest that these products are more rewarding to adult smokers, and they may be more effective at helping them to quit, which would be good. Of course, the same phenomenon, but with different terminology, is that they've got higher abuse liability, or they're more addictive among young people. So that's a property of the product, and whether it's good or bad will be a function of who's using it or for what purpose. Here's me shamelessly showing you a picture of my youngest son, highly staged in a real store. But I think that we can say that we've known that conventional cigarette marketing has always had a greater impact on youth initiation than it has had on whether adults use the product. And I think we're finding that also is true among e-cigarette marketing. And, you know, taking a step back, one of the things that we need to reflect on is the market changes. They've actually had more of an impact in bringing younger people into the market than convincing adult smokers to quit. And this is a very busy graph that I've stolen from a paper that was published. But what it shows you is that actually the period in 2017 and 2018, and I apologize for not having 2019 numbers, the period when the market was taking off, middle-aged and older adults, those in the red box, the popularity, prevalence of vaping actually decreased among middle and older aged adults over the period where the market was increasing. Most of the increases in the market were due to young adults, and you can see that black bar on the top stacked bar, that's never smokers. They contributed a very disproportionate amount to the growth of the market. And so that's, you know, probably not what we'd want to see. We'd want to see that growth accounted for by adult smokers who are using these products to try and quit. And unfortunately, the age group in which it's increased the most and in which prevalence is highest, those are least likely to use vaping for the purpose of quitting smoking, cutting back, or staying quit. And that's because there's a lot of never smokers and things like that. So the bottom line is I think we can do a much better job. Now, as I said from the outset, e-cigarettes, to my mind, the evidence is unequivocal that they can be effective as cessation aids when they're used daily and they're used for the purpose of quitting. The challenge is that most people who vape are not using e-cigarettes in that way. And that's why we see what appear to be mixed findings in trials, which people are incentivized to use them for the purpose of quitting, and they demonstrate that they're just or more effective than conventional forms of NRT, and the so-called mixed findings from population surveys, where if you look overall, e-cigarettes are associated with no greater likelihood of quitting in the future, sometimes less, unless you look at daily vapers, where they are more likely to be associated with cessation. But again, daily vapers are a minority of those that are using it. So it's a question of how can we maximize this? And I would like to point out a couple of the industry financial analysts where they talk about the ratio of new entrants to switchers. And quite simply, we can maximize the public health benefit by changing that ratio. Right now, companies like BAT suggest that more than half of vapers are new entrants to the market. Those are not the folks that are going to provide any public health benefit. And so we can ask ourselves, what are the opportunities both to reduce youth vaping without discouraging switching among adult smokers? This is typically presented as a zero-sum game. Sort of these are inevitable trade-offs. I think there are some situations where that's true. I also think that there's a lot more opportunity for soft spots where we can accomplish both of these. We can chat more about what those are. I'd like to note for folks that, like in the US, in Canada, we are having a tremendous amount of policy change around vaping. We are about to have national nicotine limits like they have in England. We have very strict flavor restrictions in some provinces, but not others. We have more comprehensive marketing restrictions. We have some interesting retail access. Now, there's different opinions on these policies. I will say, with one exception, we still have much more comprehensive restrictions on smoked cigarettes than we do vaping products. The one exception there is retail access, where some provinces are considering making access adult-only stores. And so you may have seen this post. It was an Instagram post where someone took a picture of a pharmacy that was saying, due to public health concerns, they'll no longer carry vaping products. And they put that sign right next to the cigarettes. So proportionality is an important component of this. I like to say that if we're discussing in Canada restricting access to certain vaping products to adult-only stores because of the abuse, liability, health concerns, this is a wonderful opportunity to do the same thing for conventional cigarettes. And if anything, it allows us to increase restrictions on most harmful products. So in Canada, menthol and tobacco products is banned, has been since 2017. But obviously, if people are talking about restricting flavors in vaping products, it just lends even more, importance to banning similar and other flavors in the most harmful products. Okay, I'm going to segue a little bit, and I'll try and leave a good 15 minutes for some questions and conversation, but I'm going to talk a little bit about vaping and cannabis. Now, times have changed. This is the old Reefer Madness poster. You can Google the old movie from, I can't remember when, 50s or something like that. You will know that we have federal non-medical recreational legalization in Canada. And I never thought I'd see the day when one of our provinces, so this is the government-run cannabis store in our province of New Brunswick. I never thought I'd see the day when our province was teaching people how to roll a nice joint, but you can go on and they'll teach you how to roll a nice joint. This is our government-run store in Ontario, advertising flowers for mom on Mother's Day. Very considerate. So we've had federal medical cannabis legalization since 2001. We're Canada's the second country to legalize non-medical cannabis after Uruguay, and this happened in October 2018 and over the course of the next year. Now, unlike legalization in the US states, which has often been on ballots and things like that, in Canada it was official government policy. They had time to plan it out, and it is much more based on a public health framework. But one of the challenges, whether it's Canada or US states or other jurisdictions, is that this product market is changing rapidly. So one of the things that we do is we monitor the market in Canada. We collect data on about 100,000 different products a year, their price and THC levels. As of March 2020, when we scanned the market, we found over 30,000 unique legal products in Canada and about 86,000 illegal products. And the diversity is amazing. So there's dried flower, but you have pre-rolls and things like moon rockets. What are moon rockets? Well, that's a pre-rolled joint dipped in butane hash oil, and sometimes they contain little bits of concentrate so that it doubles or triples the potency. 57,000 different flower products we found. You have oral administration. So the oils, liquid drops, capsules, edibles, drinks, oral sprays, tinctures. You have transdermal. So, most of you will be familiar with NRT patch. Well, you can get topical patches for THC and CBD. And then we have concentrates, which is a very eclectic category. Everything from vape oils, hash, keef, butter, batter, resin, rosin, shatter, wax, different types of distillates, and there are literally tens of thousands. Just in case people thought that we didn't have enough, we have the proliferation of non-THC containing CBD products. So there's Papa and Barkley, and if you really want, we found over 3,500 products for pets. Now, we can talk about that after, but the bottom line is that the market is changing rapidly. You hear people say that the potency has gone up. It has. So in dried flower in the 1970s, THC levels were typically 2 to 5%. They're now, the average out around 20%, and they go up to about 30%. So yes, they have gone up by, anywhere from 7 to 10 times. But if dried flower peaks out at 30%, these other categories like solid concentrates can exceed 90%. So forget about the potency increase in dried flower. It's orders of magnitude higher. And this just gives you some relative sense of the potency of these different products. And I've put vape oils on the screen. Now, the light green bar is products that we identified from legal outlets in Canada. The dark green is illegal. You can see that the labeled concentrations, the average concentrations for vape oils, are between 70 and 90%. So that blows hash out of the water and dried herbs and everything else. I'm going to skip by. So let's talk about vape oils and vaping. And some of you will know that the history of vaping for nicotine and e-cigarettes is actually predated by a history of cannabis vaping. So this is one of the most popular commercial products, and it was called the Volcano. And the idea is you put dried flower in there, you heated it up, it would fill the bag, and then you would pass the bag around at a big party. Now, we were trying to do research some years ago, and this was the best product that we could find, and we thought, we can't use this in a research setting. It looks like we're, having a party in the basement in the 70s. But that, this technology was then refined into sort of handheld vaporizers that became e-cigarettes. Now, the products have changed, and I come back to this in a minute, but there are actually 3 types of cannabis vaping. And some people aren't aware of this, but you can vape dried herb or dried flower. So that's the product on the left. You can vape manufactured vape oil. That's what I was talking about before. And then you can also vape solid concentrates. So instead of it being in a vape oil, it's like a solid concentrate. You put it in that thing, it heats it up. And you can see again that they all have different sort of concentrations. In theory, you can buy vape oils with 1% THC, but commonly it's in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And these are the most popular products among the 3 ways to vape. And it's growing most among young people. This is a snapshot in the past 12 months of the different types of cannabis products among past year cannabis consumers. And you can see that vape oils are in 3rd place. I've highlighted them there for you. You can see that it's actually higher. Now, those little flags, the flag with the leaf wrapped around it, that represents the US states that have legalized recreational cannabis. But you can see it's the same as in states that have not, and it's quite a bit higher than it is in Canada. And interestingly, if you look at frequency of use, people talk a lot about edibles, and lots of people are using edibles, but people don't use edibles as their daily product. It takes a couple hours for onset, it lasts longer. That's probably not your Tuesday morning or Tuesday night product. That's much more likely to be dried herb or vape oils, which are the products that most people report using daily or weekly. And these products are much more popular among youngest users. And so you can see that vape oils among 16 to 20 years of age, all of whom would be under the minimum legal age in US states, you can see that vape oils are much more popular than older cannabis consumers. And it's the biggest difference that we have. And in our own ITC data, we ask about cannabis products. And if you look among cannabis consumers, you can see that smoking cannabis as a mode of administration has actually gone down a little bit. Cannabis edibles have gone up a little bit in the US and Canada. They're higher than they are in England. Here's solid concentrates. You can see how much they've gone up in North America. And here's vaping dried herb. It hasn't changed very much. But here's vaping THC oils. And we have new data that I should be adding to these graphs, but you can see this is the category that's taken off among the youngest consumers, and it is also the one for which the products have among the highest potency. So, who cares? Well, there's actually a lot of integration and overlap between the nicotine and tobacco market. So Marlboro spent over $2.5 billion on one of our cannabis companies in Canada. British American Tobacco just made an investment this past week in a cannabis company in Canada. And we have overlap in companies. So the most popular vape for dried cannabis herb is made by PAX. What did PAX make? It made Juul e-cigarettes. And now PAX also makes one of the most popular vape devices for oils. So you see a lot of integration corporately, and some of the great technology that really led Juul to its increase in popularity for nicotine is also happening in terms of the cannabis for both the dried flower and vape oils. And you don't even have to look at these numbers. The bottom line is whatever survey you look at finds a lot of overlap between vaping, nicotine, and cannabis. You can even use some of the same devices. So is that genuine? Yes, it is. One of the questions that people have is whether in population-based surveys, they question, well, the rise in nicotine vaping and e-cigarettes, maybe we're just picking up the rise in cannabis vaping. And so in our own surveys, we spent some time asking this in different ways and circling back with respondents. And the bottom line is that we actually find a minimum misclassification. of cannabis-only vapors. So we ask people what they vape. We ask about cannabis. We go back and say, oh, were you just talking about nicotine or cannabis? And the amount of misclassification in terms of percentage points is very low. It is a genuine increase in both nicotine and THC or cannabis vaping. And what's interesting is that on, of course, the nicotine side, we talk about vapes and e-cigarettes as potential harm reduction for current consumers, for current smokers. Well, the difference you have on the cannabis side is that these products have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times the potency of some other products. And there are real concerns about what that potency means for problematic use and dependence, etc. And as you will know, the outbreak of a valley was primarily due to THC vape oils and the inclusion of vitamin E acetate, which is an adulterant that should not have been in there. It was primarily in unregulated or illegal vape oils, but there are all sorts of concerns about the types of chemicals that are also included in legal vape oils. Oregon is looking into this. And I can tell you from talking to a couple of the biggest cannabis companies in the world that when this thing hit, they reached out to me to talk about vaping, and they privately told me that they do not have very much evidence on what happens to things like terpenes. Those are the oils and flavors that are added back in. What happens when you heat and vaporize and inhale them in the concentrations that they exist? So this is it's actually a much different discussion, and it could be that vaping THC oils, it could be a harm reduction practice for very frequent cannabis users that currently smoke, but there are also differences of risks. And interestingly, no US states and federally in Canada, there are no limits on THC levels. There's no limits on potency. They don't ban any products. The only place that happens is the province of Quebec, which says that they have a THC limit of 30% on any product, including THC vape oils. And I actually, again, taking aside whether people think it's good or bad, we are seeing the same phenomenon that we saw for Juul e-cigarettes, 5 years ago. And that is that we have these lovely products that are very easy to use, easy for kids to conceal. They don't smell, they're super convenient, and they come in lovely flavors. And this is from our Ontario government website. And anyone who is surprised that my daughter actually my 7-year-old walked behind me and she said, "Daddy, what's that? That looks really good." I mean, these products appeal to everyone and they especially appeal to kids. But we have very little research on the types of products that are most popular. And so this is a great area for anyone who's interested in getting into it. So I've talked myself dry. That's not an expression. My mouth is dry is what I'm trying to say. So a couple of things specific to cannabis. Look, the tendency is for people to look at legalization as a binary existence. Legalization is a process. I always point out to people that cigarettes have been legal forever, and yet the way we regulate them now is very different than the 1950s. And it's true of cannabis products, which is, okay, now that they're legal, now regulators are asking what rules should we have? And this is where evidence can be very helpful. There's a lot of overlap between vaping, cannabis, and THC, one of the fastest growing modes of use among young people. And we need to start thinking about how we want to shape legal markets. And I think we're starting to do that now. So I lead an international study called International Cannabis Policy Study, funnily enough. It does have a website. We collect data on behalf of about half the legal states. And just like my nicotine and tobacco surveys, this is annual surveys with about 50,000 people in Canada and the US. And it's really to answer some of these questions. So if people have an interest in it, feel free to follow up. And with that, I'd like to say thanks and answer any questions if we have time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hammond. I saw a question in the chat box. Andy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask directly?
Sure. Hey, Dave. I mean, wow, just, fantastic, very contemporary. I guess so. My question with vaping, looks like we got it wrong. You know, we got the never users that are using more common, the cigarette smokers that maybe would benefit are using less. How much of this is the marketing from the manufacturers? And can our public health measures like win the day when if the companies are marketing in ways that are attractive, appealing, to the wrong group?
Well, now, I'll just say again, obviously, I don't have the answer, but I think we can do better. One of the ironies in most countries is that you're allowed to market e-cigarettes because they're tasty, because they're kind of like, you can hint at them being fun and cool to use, but you can't market them directly to smokers for the purpose of quitting. And there's a technical term for that, and that's ass backwards. Now, one of the challenges is that, we want to restrict false claims and everything else. And so the U.S. approach, as you all know, is very slow moving and cumbersome in terms of, they have to submit their products and be reviewed. But part of it is just turning the benefits of marketing towards the consumer groups who should be a legitimate target. And I would say clearly that's not happened. We just went through a scan for Health Canada, and the thousands of products and the way they're being marketed are some, frankly, ridiculous. And I don't think you could confuse a lot of those ways with a legitimate harm reduction. So can we do a better job? I think we can. I do think that the type of marketing we've seen, again, is much more better bringing young kids in the market than it is reaching older adults. And in fact, now many people will not agree with me in this, but I think there's a question about if you restrict some, for example, chocolate chip cookie dough, if you restrict some of the crazy designs and cartoony things out there, I actually think that there's a big chunk of adult smokers who aren't using these because they see them as something kids use. They don't want another lifestyle product. I actually think that if you made them look a little bit more like a cessation product, that there's a big chunk of smokers that might be more likely to want to use them. Now, that doesn't mean you have to make them prescription only, but I think that there's actually a lot of movement in there, and it's counterintuitive, but I think cleaning up some aspects of this market might actually make them more attractive to the big group of adult smokers, who, especially older smokers, who frankly aren't interested in going there. The really tricky ones is where you draw the line with flavor restrictions, where you draw the line with nicotine limits. Is a product that delivers nicotine like a cigarette more likely to help someone quit? I think it very well could be. But that's why I got excited when there were certain, like my province of Ontario said, you can sell them. You can sell below 20 milligrams in a regular corner store. You want to sell higher than that, then you go in an adult-only store. I like the principle of that. It's like saying, well, products that have a greater abuse liability, we're going to keep them on the market, but we're going to reduce access. And it actually incentivizes companies, I think, to some extent to do that. And I love the idea of applying that same principle to conventional tobacco products. Retail access is one area where we've seen very little change and improvement in policy internationally, but it actually establishes that principle. So anyway, Andy, I don't have the answer, but I'm not as pessimistic as some folks are about some of the regulations and adult smokers using these products. I think we need to be thoughtful about it, but we're going to learn a lot in the next 12 to 24 months, I think.
Okay, there's a comment from Jonathan. I find it interesting that Drew worked at PAX that has marijuana vapes for the different types of marijuana, but is never talked about.
Yeah, look, I tell you what, PAX, which again, Juul came out of PAX. What they've done very, very well is make something that's easy to use. It's damn convenient, and it looks nice and it's modern. And they've done the same thing for cannabis. It's just that it's flown under the radar. And what happened is these vapes for cannabis, like the PAX, and there's lots of them. They were starting to gain some speed, and then you had THC vape oils come out. So it's so interesting because cannabis vaping started the move before e-cigarettes were a thing. And then what they did with e-cigarettes and e-liquids was, improve the devices, but also it's the manufacturing of the cartridges and e-liquids. And that's what swung back into the cannabis market in the last 5 years. And it's very interesting. PAX itself doesn't make the THC vape oils. What they do is they've done their device to partner with other cannabis producers that make the cartridges. So I just bought a bunch of them I have a store right down the street from me, and we just bought some to characterize them. But they do a wonderful job of it, and they know what they're doing. And again, it's like everything else. Now, we don't see the same level of respiratory issues for cannabis consumers simply because even very intense cannabis consumers don't inhale as much smoke as cigarette smokers, right? Average cigarette smoker, 15, 16 cigarettes a day. It's pretty hard to find someone smoking 15 joints a day. So there's a little bit less direct harm to reduce from a cannabis person inhaling smoke. But in theory, again, vapes could help. But you need to make sure that what you're vaping is made to high standards. We struggle with that now. And the potency issues are major. And that's the question that people have. Now, of course, you can manufacture them low, you can sort of titrate your dose, but those things pack a serious punch. When you're inhaling something that's 90% THC, it doesn't take too much.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. The next question in the chat box from Danielle Smith. It seems to be quite complicated. So do you want to ask directly, Danielle? Okay, I can read it.
Sure. Hi, Dave.
Oh.
No, I can do it. Great talk. So my question is that we know that nicotine and cannabis are often used sequentially, right, to enhance the intoxicating effects of cannabis and acts like chasing.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering in your work if you've explored the use of cannabis as a possible reason for nicotine vaping. Maybe among people that are dual users of the substances, asking questions such as, I vape nicotine to boost my cannabis high. And then kind of a related question, to what extent do you think that the cross-substance effects could serve as a contributor to youth or young adult vaping?
Well, great question. So there's a bunch of ways of the direct overlap in tobacco. So most people will know that in Europe, it's much more common to mix tobacco in a joint with the actual cannabis. You roll it up. People do that in North America, but not as much. The other way is, as Danielle said, people will have like a chaser. Like people will smoke cannabis and then smoke a cigarette, for example. The direction between cannabis vaping and nicotine vaping, it's a little bit hard to ascertain. I think we saw the increase in. By the way, I use the term e-cigarettes. I remember talking to someone from Juul. They liked the term vaping until they realized it was non-specific and it's also used for cannabis. So that's why I use the old school term e-cigarette. So the rise in e-cigarettes and nicotine predated the real rise in THC vape oils. I actually think that it went that direction. But it's common to the type of product in just that they're lovely drug delivery devices to use, particularly when you combine them with tasty flavors. And so I think it's probably like arrow that to both cannabis and nicotine use. Is it like most other types of substance use among youth, use of one substance predicts another. So a lot of it is common risk factor. But I do think that more so than most other cases of gateway and things like that, there is probably some direct causal effects from having a device and having people trading devices and different cartridges and things like that. So I've done a fairly poor job answering your question, other than to say that, the integration between these two forms of substance delivery is more integrated than I think smoking even. And it's very interesting to see how, if e-cigarette use continues to decline over the next year, what happens to THC and cannabis vaping among young people.
Okay. The next question from Deborah. Do you want to ask that directly, Deborah?
I think we're pretty much almost at time, so maybe it's faster to just read it.
Sure, I'm staring at it right now, if that helps.
Yeah.
switching to e-cigarettes from combustibles is an acceptable harm reduction is increasingly called into question by the emerging data. Conclusions from speakers were that e-cigs were not different from combustibles in respiratory or cardiovascular risks. Cancer is still unclear. Using e-cigs as a step down to total quitting is different from switching and maintaining e-cigarette use, particularly since evidence with. I mean, maybe this is a poor summary of your question, but there are many uncertainties. And I don't know about you, but as someone who tries to stay up to pace on all the literature, it is very difficult to do, both with respect to the direct health effects of vaping, even the effects on quitting. And let me leave you with one example. Some of you may have seen a brand new paper was published in Addiction this week from the UK. And the headline was, daily e-cigarette use leads to quitting. If you look at the data from that paper, if you look at overall use of e-cigarettes, people were no more likely or less likely to quit. If they used e-cigarettes daily at follow-up, they were more likely. If they didn't use daily, they were less likely. Now, the way our interpretation of these findings is we often see these things as conflicting or mixed findings. They're not. The people that are using these things to quit, and they're using those in a corresponding fashion, which is to say regularly, for the purposes of completely stop smoking, it seems to help people. When people use them for other purposes, it's either no effect or it's less effective. It undermines quitting. And there's an interesting side result in that paper which showed that cutting back, so the idea that, well, maybe you can start vaping, you don't have to want to stop right now, but maybe it'll just shoot you down that road and you'll slowly cut back. In the paper that came out this week, it suggested that that process of cutting back eventually was actually less effective. It undermined future cessation. And I think from my read of the literature, I think we can accept these truths, but our messages to smokers need to be much more clear about saying that, look, it really depends on how you're using these things. And if you're serious about quitting and you want to use it for that purpose, it could help you if you haven't had much success with the others. But you know what? If you're just using these infrequently and socially, it might actually undermine your likelihood of quitting. That, to me, is the clearest message that reflects both the trials, the population-based prospective cohort studies, but the way we communicate and understand some of these findings, I don't think is helping the public discourse. And I saw that again this week, where the flashy headline is "They help you quit," with the incredibly important, criteria that, well, it was only among the subgroup that were using it regularly for that purpose. Overall, it had little or was counterproductive. And anyway, it's a very challenging area, and I apologize if I've done an injustice to your question, but I certainly don't pretend to have the answers on these things.
Thank you. There are two more questions. I hope the time should be okay. I'll be quick. Is there the same product visibility ban for vape products as there is for tobacco in Canada?
I'm sorry, is there the same product visibility ban? No. So in Canada, we have comprehensive point of sale restrictions for cigarettes. You can't see them. You walk into any type of store, they're behind the thing. You just have to ask for them. For vaping, we have not had that, but we're moving in that direction. So I think we will have that. And like in the US, the market has really shifted towards corner convenience gas stations. Those are dominated by Juul and Vape-fused BAT ones. And then you have vape shops. And interestingly, this doesn't get a lot of play, but they have very different positions. So our Vape Shop Association in Canada has said that they are in favor of a nicotine limit.
Okay, there's one.
So, yeah, I'll shut up there.
And
then you said there's one other question.
So I have a question related to e-cigarette marketing or advertising and adolescent exposure to them. It may be the case that the exposure levels seem to be homogeneous at a provincial or higher level, while the perceived exposure at individual level might vary. Any comments or thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we've made some effort to actually monitor the advertising and marketing that's out there in the environment. And just like with tobacco, it does, the companies for the most part do follow the laws. So when it's banned in Quebec, you don't see posters and advertisements at the point of sale and things like that. So We're measuring self-reported exposure, but what we find is that it aligns very well, not just with the laws and the regulations, but also with the limited amount of actual direct environmental monitoring that we do in the advertising spaces. I think that may have been the question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Karen, do you want to make any closing remarks?
No, not really. Just yes, thank you very much, Dave. This was a great talk beyond what I had expected. Lots of great information. So thank you. I think a few people may have asked about whether slides would be available. So if you
Sure. Yep. Anyone, feel free to email me and I can send those out to you. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I may not have got to. So
great.
thanks.
Thanks so much. Great having you.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.